The plasma membrane, this is just another name for the cell membrane, and the internal and the external membranes have a lot in common. They look a lot alike, and parts of the outer cell membrane, when you take in some stuff, can actually become an inner membrane too. I love how that disappears. Pretend that's just as big as that. And so if you've got stuff out here, you could be engulfing it, and this would be the stuff engulfed. So this was the cell membrane a minute ago, and now it's an internal membrane. So that can happen too. So anyway, it's made out of these different parts. You've got a phospholipid bilayer, and so you've got the head and the tails for the phospholipid molecules. So all these gray and yellow things are the phospholipid molecules. The gray part is the hydrophilic part, which is why it's always so happy. And the yellow part are the tails, which are hydrophobic. We call it a phospholipid bilayer. Bi for two, and you can see there are two layers because you've got a layer on the top and a layer on the bottom. These brown things are proteins, and the green things are carbs. They look sort of like glucose molecules, hopefully they do to you. And so all those glucose molecules bonded together are a more bigger carb polysaccharide, or at least an oligosaccharide. And so when you have a carbohydrate on a protein, you call that a glycoprotein. And we don't see any in this picture, but if you had a carbohydrate right on a lipid, we would call it a glycolipid. And they all have different functions. The proteins have the most specialized functions, but the carbs kind of modify them from there. And then this lipid bilayer is like the main stuff of the cell. So let's skip. I have so down here it says gateway to the cell, and what this means is the cell membrane is the thing that decides, so to speak, what can go in and what can go out of the cell. So that's what most of this unit is on. So I have a video that I got to skip on because it never shows up. So what things can get in and out of the lipid bilayer? So notice with this that you can't see any proteins embedded in the cell membrane. And that's because first we want to look at what can actually go in and out of just the lipid bilayer. So you can see that some molecules can go right through and some molecules or atoms or ions cannot. And so what we want to think about is what can go through and what cannot. And so the cell membrane, first a definition, is semi-permeable, which means that only certain things can get in and out. So permeable means permeate, means can go through. Semi means some things can go through. So that means that other things cannot. So what materials can move through the lipid bilayer and what materials can't? So materials that can move through the lipid bilayer. Okay, let's take a look at this. Each one of these molecules really looks more like this. So this is sort of the more realistic picture of it. So you'll notice that this is a pretty thick area. But if you imagine lining this up with another one, there would be space between this hydrophilic head and the next hydrophilic head would be here with its tails sort of like this. So you can imagine that things could sort of squeeze in here. But if you are something that doesn't mix with lipids, you're not going to make it through. So that means that polar things can make it to about here. Actually, anything can make it to about here because there's this space between the heads, but only things that mix with lipids easily or things that are very small can get through there. So let's write that in. Small molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide and water can get through. So these things, oxygen and carbon dioxide, are nonpolar just like the lipids, so they'd be able to go through anyway. But water's a polar molecule, and you wouldn't think it would be able to go through because water does not mix with oil. And there are certainly proteins that are embedded in the membrane that let water through, but they think water is little enough to actually be able to squeeze through a little bit. So you can fit small things through. You can also fit large things as long as they're hydrophobic, or another word for hydrophobic is nonpolar. So in other words, if they can mix with lipid, then they can go right through. So that's this thing. Materials that cannot move through the lipid bilayer. So that's anything that's big enough or charged enough. So anything that does not mix with lipid. So ions, So something that would not go through would be an ion like sodium. That charged thing is crazy polar, right? Super duper polar. Super duper hydrophilic. So oil would tend to shun that. And then anything that's large. So hydrophilic molecules larger than water. I shouldn't have said anything large. Anything large that is hydrophilic cannot go through. And then large molecules like proteins, those are also things like, they're also hydrophilic. So anything really big unless it's a lipid. So here's a summary of what can go through. Um, Water can go through, and kind of little nonpolar things or things that aren't superpolar can go through. So this is water, it's polar. NH3, this is polar as well, but it's little, so it can go through. Ions cannot. They're so charged that the lipid part here really shuns them. And this picture is a little bit messed up because it's showing the head so big. It's actually the tails that are bigger, and the tails are the things that you have to worry about. Okay, so these are the nonpolar things, and the ions could get through to about here, but then they can't make it through that lipid bilayer. Hydrophobic molecules, anything that mixes with lipid can go right through. And then glucose is big enough and it's polar. So any polar molecules that are bigger like glucose, not something tiny like water, but any bigger ones like glucose cannot go through. So if that doesn't make intuitive sense to you, that's really something that you'll have to memorize. Okay, this one is just a fun, really crazy fun fact. So here's a cell, and here's a cell membrane, and here's the nucleus, and here's a steroid hormone. And the funky thing about these is that steroids, if you remember, are lipids. And we just said that lipids can go through the cell membrane. So if you have a steroid hormone like testosterone, for example, that can actually go right through the lipid bilayer, which is crazy. It can go right into the nucleus, and then it will interact with a receptor here, and here's the receptor, and it can go right to DNA and say, hey, it can tell the DNA what to do. It can say, hey, DNA, make some RNA, which can come out and make some proteins. And so it might be making a protein for you to grow a big bushy beard if this is testosterone, or it might be a signal to grow bigger muscles. So this is a very cool example, I think so. So the steroid hormone went right through the lipid bilayer because both the lipid bilayer and the hormone, in this case, are lipids. They're both hydrophobic. Quiz time. What materials can go through the lipid bilayer? Let's see. Large hydrophilic molecules. No, definitely not, because if it's large and it loves water, then it's not going to mix with oil. Large hydrophobic molecules. Yep, that one can. So we'll say yes. Small uncharged hydrophilic molecules like water. As long as it's small enough, it can go. Small hydrophobic, yeah, anything hydrophobic. I don't care if it's big or small, can go. Ions, no. So boom, boom, and boom. What materials can go through the lipid bilayer? Thought I just did this. So large polar molecules, no. Large nonpolar, sure. Small uncharged polar, didn't I just do this? Small nonpolar molecules, um, yeah, nonpolar can do it. As long as it's small, then the polar ones can, and ions definitely not. Did I just go backwards? Okay, there we are. What materials can go through the plasma membrane? Glucose, nope, it's charged and it's big enough. Proteins, nope. I shouldn't have said charged, it's polar and big enough. That would be a no. Proteins are polar and big, so that would be a no. Steroids, yep, it's a lipid. Water, yeah, it's little enough. Ions, no, 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 no. Oxygen is little and it's nonpolar anyway. What materials cannot go through the lipid bilayer? Let's see, ones that cannot go through. Large hydrophilic molecules, yeah, like glucose, that one cannot go through. So that would be one of the answers. Large hydrophobic ones can go through. Small uncharged hydrophilic, that can go through. Small hydrophobic molecules can go through. Ions cannot go through. So that's what we're looking for. All right, did enough of these. What materials cannot go through the plasma membrane? Let's see. Thought I did this already. Glucose cannot go through. Proteins, again, too big, cannot go through. Steroids can, water can, ions cannot. So here's the deal. If it's got a charge on it, then it cannot go through. And if it's something that's big and polar, it cannot go through. Lipids can absolutely go through, and then oxygen's nonpolar and water's tiny. Types of transport across membranes. I think we're going to stop here.